This episode is brought to you by Rescue Intelitech, innovating solutions to keep firefighters safe. Their Solo Rescue Decon Washer helps reduce cancer risks by cleaning contaminated gear quickly and effectively. Learn more at rescueintelitech.com because clean gear saves lives.
Welcome back to another episode of this podcast of Apparatus Workshop from Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment. My name is Nick Wilbur, joined by Slauch as always. We're going to dive right into this one. I think it's a pretty interesting one. It's an episode that we're going to talk about the transition from where the spec committee kind of finishes their job, quote unquote, and takes over into like the training and kind of operational thought process. And, you know, I think a lot of people think when that fire truck gets delivered that everyone high fives and the specking committee is done and their job's over. And I think that both actively and kind of in the background, there's a lot of work that needs to be considered or done when this fire truck comes in. So that's kind of, if there's an overarching, title to this podcast, it's when the rig comes in, and just your thoughts, considerations, and things like that of what you should be doing as a spec committee. And with these long lead times, some of that you can be doing while they're kind of building the fire truck to an extent. And so, I have a whole lot of stuff kind of written down here. I'm going to throw it to Win. And kind of when the rig comes in, we've done this in Arlington, obviously, and then obviously in your volunteer firehouse as well, and when helping kind of other clientele. But what do you think, like rig comes in, it gets delivered from the factory, what's like the top 5 for you to consider, things to do, like spec committee, like reconvening, like what is their thought process when that thing comes in after obviously all the shining lights and pictures and Facebook posts and all that?
I think top 5. I probably won't get to 5. I don't know. I'm not going to count them out here. We'll just start and run down a list. I think the first thing I want to do, and that I, tell everybody that we work with to do, is you essentially need to do a reinspection of the apparatus. Presumably, when you left the factory, there were anywhere between, 50 to 100 things that were wrong. Maybe there's less, maybe there's even more, but between paint issues, mechanical issues, wires or electrical circuits not being, wired exactly the way you expected them, any myriad of things that you can find, all that stuff was supposed to be fixed. And, hopefully your dealer had somebody who could re-inspect that, or at least kind of ensure that those items were fixed. Maybe your manufacturer sends you pictures as they're corrected. But again, you want to make sure that stuff was corrected. You left the factory with the anticipation that it was going to be fixed, and this is your opportunity to make sure that it's fixed before you take ownership of it. Ideally, at this point, you still don't own this fire truck. So, again, let's get it fixed. So, when that truck comes in to wherever you schedule to have it delivered to, the factory or the dealer or your firehouse, spend 3-4 hours and go through that final inspection process again. And there's kind of 2 things. You could say, all right, well, I don't need to do the whole thing. I'm just going to hit the parts that we, had issues with. But again, most of the time this apparatus was just driven hundreds of miles from your manufacturer to your dealer or to your firehouse. So you need to utilize this opportunity. The whole point of part of that drive is to break it in. So what happened on the break-in? Did something break? Did something get scratched? Did the driver say that something doesn't feel right? Is there a shimmy or a shake somewhere? This is an opportunity to kind of fix that stuff and get it ironed out. So I think that's number 1 is let's re-inspect this thing and make sure that it is what we expected it to be before we have to pay for it.
Yeah, I almost feel like you kind of said, redo the final inspection. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, at this point, this is the final inspection. We talk about going out to the factory being the final inspection. That is just really an inspection, because anything that you find wrong, there's no way to find, to check to make sure that it's good or to your spec, or like they're not fixing it while you're out there. So until that rig shows up, that's like kind of the last chance to kind of throw out there what is wrong, what you don't like about it, and all that. And I think that's probably the most comprehensive final inspection you can do, because there's a lot of things that we might ask for as a specification committee, or when we're just speccing the rig, that we might not be able to check out there either. I mean, just like fitting in the firehouse, you can do all the measuring tapes you want in the world, but if you have a steep ramp or some weird kind of topography to deal with, like, you don't know until it drives in, for 100%, and you back it in there and everything's kind of good to go. So I think there's a lot of final inspection items that really need to take place then. And that's that final delivery, final inspection kind of phase. So I would agree 100%. And just what's rubbing, all the paint looks good underneath the cab, but they just drove it 150, 200 miles. You tilt that cab and you notice any rubbing or anything, like that's a huge concern. Like, hey, this hasn't even been that many miles per se, or it's been straight on a highway. Like, why are we having some sort of issues or bolts or something missing now? Like that would be something I'd want to get addressed right away. So for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And couple things there, ideally, that this thing's going to fit in your firehouse before you back it in there. And
ideally,
we worked on that long before they started bending metal, right? That before we even signed a contract, we made sure of that. But even then, sometimes it gets missed, right? Ideally, you have a measurement that you give them, and they say this is it. But that's something that you want to check at that final inspection at the factory. But again, it's easy to miss something as simple as that. Hey, I need to stretch a tape measure out and measure this and make sure that it is exactly what they said it was going to be, because this is what we told them it had to be. Same thing height wise. Like, we need to get a level line up on top of that truck and get the highest measurement for what that truck is and double check it. But you're right. If that hasn't been done at the factory, then we need to do it now. There was another thing in there that I was going with the driving it back.
If the driver looks like they need to go to the hospital after they delivered it to you, then you should probably check the suspension and weights and things. Yeah.
Right. The kidneys are bad or whatever. Yeah, for sure. But, kind of along with that, and this is something we talk about constantly, so this isn't going to be a new surprise to anybody, but, and this one might be down the road a little bit, but we need to get a weight on it, right? Mm-hmm. Ideally, we weighted at the factory with the water on it. We can do the math with the hose and everything, and then we can add in the NFPA, minimum weight that they're dealing with, or whatever weight we told them, and come up with a weight based on what we see. But until we get all of our equipment mounted and tools on it, we don't have that ability to truly see that. So, that's something that has to continue through the process of putting this apparatus in service, is we need to get a final weight on it eventually. And ideally, hopefully you can find a place where you can do individual wheels. But if not, the front axle and the rear axle, or rear two axles, depending, kind of becomes the key there. We want to make sure that we're within weight and that we're not overloading this truck based on something that we do. So it's those are like two of the big things. It's a carryover kind of that initial final inspection. But this is your true final inspection. And at this point, you probably, and maybe you did, but if you did pay money for this, you still have a performance bond, hopefully. But if you didn't pay any money, this is your last opportunity to find the issues. And, obviously there's warranties and things like that, but, it essentially becomes your truck after you pay money for it. So you want to make sure that this is all ironed out prior to that.
Yeah. And with that, going on the quote unquote last final inspection thing, there's times that we recommend, and we've talked about this on podcasts before, performance standards, right? So, we have this big hill that we need to climb. I'm not an engine, engineer, lack of a better term, right? So I wouldn't be able to spec the correct torque and power and horsepower that would be needed to carry this ladder truck full of equipment up this hill and go at 45 miles an hour because I don't want to go below 45 on this grade. Well, so I don't want to say I need this type of engine with this type of gearing. That's not my realm, right? We've talked about leaning on the engineers to do their job to engineer it correctly, right? Well, so this could be a performance standard. Hey, this hill, this is what it looks like. Here's my hill. Here's the grade, whatever information you're going to give, right? We're going to go out there and we're going to give you all that stuff. And you're going to give me a fire truck that doesn't fall below 30 miles an hour, let's say up that hill. Well, if you wrote that down in your spec, the only way to test that is now loading the fire truck up with all the equipment with the appropriate weight and going and climbing that hill and making sure that you can meet that standard. So I think, it's nice to write a lot of that stuff down. We talk about including that into our contract, but then we have to kind of follow through with that and double check to make sure that we're actually getting what we're asking for. If there's a performance standard to fit in a certain area, whether it's a firehouse or whatever, like let's go check that. I can't think of other performance standards now off the top of my head, but there's a whole lot out there that you might have to run into, angle of approach or departure, if that was a performance standard, right? All of that stuff that we capture that we ask for, or if we just knew, hey, our old, ladder truck or engine or pumper tanker had an angle of approach or departure of 11 degrees. This one has the same. It should fit. Let's go double check, right? Because that could be the make or break in their certain apartment complexes or access, whatever that looks like. So we want to make sure we're kind of checking some of the things that we specifically asked for, or that we, again, this is a custom fire truck. We built it for our response area, our first due, our people, our operations. So like run it through some of those paces that you would expect it to do. It could be a cookie cutter from the last spec and they changed something that you didn't really pay attention to or didn't think it was a big deal. And, it could be as simple as going from, like a carriage bolt or something to just a regular bolt. And now hose is getting hung up in a place that you didn't think it would get hung up on, or you can't fit as much hose or it doesn't pack the same. There's so many little tweaks there that copy and paste, if you don't specify 100% down to the nut and bolt, it could actually change without you thinking it's going to change based on what day it went down the factory line and what that person, took the spec to mean. And, we caught a lot of that stuff on finals where we took information down on a final inspection and said, what they did meets the spec, but it wasn't meeting our intention. So how do we write this spec differently to meet that? And I think that's almost another, meeting or wrap around later on. But I think there's a lot there that even if you copy and paste the spec, if you had a perfect engine and you just did it again, there's so much work I think that still needs to be done to look at that vehicle. It's not just, well, they did it right last time, so it's going to be right again. That like you really need to dig deep into that and do the work, unfortunately. But
yeah, and I think what you see there is that the work doesn't stop, right? You start with the work way, way, way before you even put anything on paper with whatever you're going to purchase and how you're going to, evaluate things, and it continues through because at some point there is another purchase. So, that thing comes back. You want to make sure that you have good notes about what was wrong, what the misinterpretations were, things like that, and continue to carry that through for that next spec. So, I think in that case, you're right that work kind of continues through that whole inspection process. And in all honesty, it's going to continue through the first year of you running that apparatus, because you're going to find stuff that you even missed, a year down the road. You're going to say, oh man, that shouldn't have been like that. Those doors should have alarms on them or whatever. And I think that when you go to a final inspection, there's only a certain number of people that you can take with you, right? And, those people could be from all over. They could have experience doing inspections or none. But even the best people are going to miss something. There's something that they miss, or they get distracted and they skip over something. So, again, having a second set of eyes, that may be a second group, to come and help evaluate that one or two extra people who weren't at that final inspection. You might be able to also find some other stuff that you missed that you can still, at this point, get taken care of.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that was, the recent tower in Arlington. We side stacked, 16 two-section ladders, which was great. We actually had a compartment below that we put a Stokes basket in. Like, to me, that was great, functional. A lot of guys in the final inspection loved it. It was great. We get it back, and now somebody on another shift, I'm 6'3", is 5'10", 5'11", 5'9", whatever the height is, that's shorter. And it's like, wow, that's like those ladders actually, that top ladder is pretty difficult to grab. And you're like, well, like that's, I didn't think about it in my perspective because I'm a taller guy, like whatever, didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. It's like, oh, it was a little higher, but, it's still reachable. But you don't necessarily think about the perspective of the other people that might be riding that rig. And you start looking at who went out to do final inspection of that rig, and they're all 6 foot or higher. So like everybody that said it was okay is because they were all tall enough to make it think like it was okay. And again, it's not the end of the world. It's still okay, but that's just one of those things you look back and it's like, all right, well, how often are we using the Stokes basket versus those ladders? Do we put the Stokes basket in another spot or in the top part now and bring those ladders down lower? Because that's going to be an everyday thought process for us. So, mission of the vehicle, the ladders were important, but maybe we didn't stack them as important as we should have. And that's something week one, month one, through training and getting that thing in service and just running calls, we found out. And so that's a note for the next time. For us, luckily, that's 8 years that we're going to replace that vehicle. For others, it could be 20. And so that might even be something that you take a note and figure out, all right, well, in the budget, we might do a rehab at 10 years to keep this thing going. That would be number one item in the rehab. We're actually going to change that around and maybe rework it. Or it's that big of an issue that you're going to rework it now, and possibly move that stuff around. So I think that's one of those things that, you got to tuck the ego aside. And I think with the committee, they're starting it from the beginning and kind of carrying it through the end. When committee meets rest of the fire company or department, I think there's there's going to be some tension there, which is good, right? Like, how can I make this better? And as a committee, we should be asking that and accepting the feedback. And then also kind of informing them why we made a decision. Like, yeah, that sounds good, but here's what we lose with that. We didn't think that was worth it. And I think there's a lot of good conversation that can happen there. And then that informs you for your next purchase, right? If you are in a bigger department, you're stacking them up, and you might even have another rig under contract already that now, when you go to pre-engineering, you have changes to make now because you found some things that were wrong. But if you just copy and paste a spec and just ride it out for the next 10 years and don't have that hardcore look when it comes in, you're going to miss stuff, and it's going to be a pretty big problem as you kind of go through there. So yeah, I think there's a lot there with that. But other things like looking at the spec, I think there's a lot that we as a committee might ask for that the general pop or general public, general department, general membership doesn't know or understand. So I'll give you, for instance, a lot of times when I go do the ladder training, I say, where's your operator's manual for ladder truck? They bring it out, and it's a somewhat generic thing. And we've kind of talked about this or mentioned about it, right, over these podcasts. Well, how do we figure out what this ladder truck was spec'd with, right? Because there's a lot of times in the manual it'll say, if equipped or if spec'd or whatever. So like you go through and there's maybe 30 or 40 pages of stuff that may or may not apply to a rig, even tip loading, right? Like, what was the tip load and the wind speed that you spec'd it for? If you weren't part of that committee, you might not understand that information or know that information. So how do we make either the spec available to the general department membership, or do we send somebody and say, hey, I want you to go through the spec list, what we did, our intentions behind it, go through the operator's manual and highlight all the stuff that applies or cross out the stuff that doesn't apply. So now we have a usable operator's manual, and the brand new truck driver can then go look through it and isn't confused halfway through what the rig has or doesn't have or options or whatever, and kind of make a custom manual. You don't want to alter the text, but you want to highlight the things that are options that were selected by the committee, and then even maybe provide some sort of a high level PowerPoint or explanation behind it. Because I think now in the fire service, the why is so important. And so you just go out there and say, hey, here's all this stuff. Like, why do I have this stuff? Why is this on there, right? And then that helps, again, the next purchase. Like, we did it for X, Y, and Z. we don't even run those types of calls anymore, right? So like, let's say you put extrication stuff on a ladder truck and you had this cool new rope rescue setup thing. Well, now all the rope rescue guys that were volunteers are gone, starting to be, forming maybe a career department. Now there's a career tech rescue team for the county or the municipality or the area. And now we don't maybe run as many rope rescues, or we don't run them because we don't have the training anymore. Well, if that was the reason you put it on the rig, you might be able to save a couple $100 on the next rig and not put it on there because that's not an operation we do anymore. So I think there's a lot in there that as a committee that kind of falls on you. And we're going to start getting into this area of where training and the spec committee kind of meet together and how you need to kind of commingle / work together and then figure out where that handoff is of like, all right, well, this is no longer a spec committee issue. Now it's a training issue. But again, making sure that there's that smooth transition there.
Yeah, and I think, again, that you're right. You do want to kind of make it your own operator's manual, right? Your custom operator's manual. And like you said, you don't want to change the verbiage. You want to make sure that you maintain that. But if you added something or, and for example, on the last round of pumpers we did in Arlington, in preparation for changes in the way we do high-rise firefighting and supply those buildings, we added 2 hooks to the side of the fire truck so that we could tie our hose back when we're pumping high pressures into the buildings. Well, if that's not in the operator's manual and you don't do a good job explaining that through your training process, or you only have one of those come in at that point because it's the first one, then the rest of the department might not understand why those are there. And then they just become these things that are on the side of the fire truck that have no purpose until you can explain them. But if you can build that into your operator's manual, hey, these are the hooks, these are what they're for, this is a procedure for it. And, again, at that point, you're kind of transitioning between the spec committee and the training committee at that point. But you're right, you have to marry those two together and say, hey, this is what we did this for, this is where we're going to go. And hopefully the training committee has some understanding of that already based on the operations that are occurring, in the field. So again, it's kind of like a big circle of everybody has to kind of talk together in order to build this fire truck and put it in service. But it's that education process that has to continue from the spec committee to the training committee, and down the road to operations at that point. So yeah, you have to, and again, if you go on your manufacturer's website or they send you the binders and NFPA requires that operations manual be on the fire truck at this point, if you dig into it, it might not be exactly the fire truck that you built. So you have to kind of go through that and say, hey, these are the things that matter here. These don't. You can cross them out or whatever. But you, as the operator of that apparatus, need to understand that. And again, the only way to do that is to get in the operator's manual and make sure you know exactly what you're looking for.
And I think there's some sort of responsibility too. There's the go-getters, right, if you will, of the department, of the spec committee, of training, of all that stuff, right, and getting those people in the room. And there's going to be gaps, like the operator's manual, all that stuff is not all encompassing, and it's interesting. Like, you look at somebody like, hey, I want to drive the new tower. Like, all right, here's the manuals to start at, and read and kind of understand these because like these are the rules of the road. And you just look at their eyes, and it's like you just hand them 3 manuals now. One's 200 pages just around, the other one's like 280 for the operator's manual, owner's manual for the chassis. And you're like, you're not going to need to know or understand all 300 pages, but there's probably like 30 pages in here that are pretty important. Good luck finding them. So like, how do we maybe capture the relevant information for each position too? You get a new rig in, and the owner's operator's manual for the chassis, a lot of that doesn't necessarily apply to the day-to-day driver, right? There might be some, first day check stuff or like day-to-day operational checks that you might need to do, some things that might be kind of useful to understand, if there's some sort of auxiliary braking system, if there's a manual for that, like, high level looking at that. But all the maintenance, the parts, the other stuff like that, that's all stuff that they don't need to know. But who fixes your fire truck, right? For us in Arlington, we have a shop. That's great. That's a county shop that we can go down to that they fix the fire trucks. They're somewhat involved in our specking process, so they kind of help go through that process. They're informed about that. But if you're in a smaller town or you don't have your own shop, or maybe you don't have a good relationship with the shop that's working on it, when those books come in, somebody from the specking committee should be going down there and saying, hey, here's some things that we spec'd on this rig. What's going to change in how we need to maintain this rig, inspect this rig, all of those things, right? So as we're doing our training for our drivers, you have a 1990s era fire truck and, you just started to replace it and it just came in this year in 2026, 30 years of technology has now been integrated into this thing. Do you still do the same daily check that you would, if you're coming in on a shift work or a weekly check or monthly check in a volunteer firehouse? Do you still do the same exact check that you did of this fire truck 30 years ago to the one today? The answer is probably not. Are there similarities? Absolutely. But depending on what you spec'd on this rig, the valves might need to be worked differently. There might be, need to be different PM, preventive maintenance standards now, depending on different suspension types and things. There's a whole lot of stuff that comes into what this rig might need now compared to the old rig. And so it goes past even training now and into maybe maintenance and now even farther into budget, right? Things that we don't like to talk about a lot, right? Especially on a spec committee. A lot of times here's your Visa Gold card, here's your limit, and make sure you spend underneath that. And that's kind of it. But what are the implications of what we're spending on this rig into the future and the components that we put on it, right? And it could be good, bad, or indifferent. And some of it, it's just the cost of doing business. And that's fine, right? Like, we've talked about electronic valves and like how there's places that they're needed, but they might be expensive to fix. So like, that's just a consideration. And hey, I need electronic valves in these locations because of staffing or XYZ, whatever your thing, or space. Great. But now it might cost more. So how do we look at the budget now and kind of wrap all that in and say, okay, because I did these couple things that are different from the last rig, let's watch that, because that might be a cost savings or we might be spending more money. And whatever way that is, again, cost of doing business to an extent. So how can we capture that? How can we inform, the municipality, other people involved, the stakeholders, to let them know that this might be coming down the pike, that in 5-10 years, there's going to be more costs now associated, because instead of every 6 months or every year, we need to go to the shop every 6 months now and do an inspection. So now it's going to cost twice as much in inspections, whether it's $1,000, whatever it is. That's going to slowly start to add up a little bit over time. And again, that's just something we want to understand and be aware of. Cost of doing business, I get it, but we can't just go blindly and just start checking boxes on this thing. And then once the fire truck comes in, spec committee goes away, it goes to the shop, and all of a sudden the budget people are like, whoa, what's going on? Or worse, you're missing important things that should be done that you're not doing because no one bothered to follow up and say, hey, this fire truck's 30 years newer now. Business as usual isn't the same thing. We've changed so much now.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a couple of points there where you as an operator might not be required to maintain the truck, but somebody is, right? And you're responsible to kind of be able to identify issues for them, but still somebody's responsible for maintaining that truck. So somebody has to create that maintenance timeline of when it's going to go in, right? Did we go from a solid rear axle to an air ride that has to be readjusted at 5,000 miles or 100 hours into its service life, right? So, do we have an independent front suspension that has to be dialed in once all the weight's on it? Again, these are things that you don't necessarily know. So if you go from a solid front axle or a solid rear axle to an independent front or an air ride or any of the other types of axles that are out there now, the maintenance requirements and even the break-in period is going to be different on them. That if you don't follow through with it in the time frame that's supposed to be, you could, affect your warranty. You could, all kinds of things that come into play. So this is part of that like education process that should be going on. You talked about, maybe we do some of this while the truck's being built. What's going on in a truck at this point. So let's get the manuals for the axles. Let's get the manuals for the the Jake brake or the Telma retarder or whatever else we're going to put on this thing. Let's get those products and let's learn what we have to do with it. How do we care for the snow chains, for things like that, right? We got to kind of start to build that process out. And hey, every 5,000 miles, this thing has to go, because now the air ride suspension has to be checked every 5,000 miles. The front suspension needs to be readjusted. The valves need to be greased or whatever it happens to be. Again, the aerial ladder needs to be cleaned and re-greased in this time frame. It all becomes, part of that process. And like you said, it does play into your overall budget. A paid fire department that runs, 20 or 30 calls a day is going to have an increased maintenance cost over the volunteer fire department with the same apparatus who are running, 5 calls a week. So, all of that has to play together, and you have to make that stuff, that maintenance requirements and that schedule up. So, yeah, I mean, there's still, again, when we're talking about work, there's a lot of work that has to go into this thing. And some of it, like you said, can be done long before the fire truck ever arrives.
Yeah, I think it's something that can't be overlooked either, because, we've seen major headlines from major fire departments that have learned the hard way of not following that, right? Whether it's a defect in how it was built, all these things out there, right? Or accidents that were happening, or, the wheels falling off, if everyone remembers those stories happening, right? There's a lot more that went into that. And it's not just pointing fingers at the manufacturer or the component manufacturer of that particular piece. A lot of those fingers start pointing every which way of the manufacturer, the component manufacturer, or the fire department didn't inform, didn't know, didn't understand that component in its entirety and what maintenance, inspections or things were required with it. And so now all of these pieces kind of fell apart. And so that can become a huge safety concern down the road. And I think, if nothing else, if you're sitting here listening to this and your head's getting ready to explode because Wynn can talk about tires, suspension, and stuff in a whole nother level than most people out there, which is why he's here, because it makes me look better with all of his knowledge, right? But when you can start getting into that upper level, it's, well, if you don't understand that, find somebody that does, right? And it's not necessarily a consultant, but try finding somebody that's a mechanic, the local mechanic, get them on that committee, because that then lessens the work in the future, right? When they're sitting in the room and they can ask the questions that need to be asked and maybe provide the information because they see different manufacturers of fire trucks or different rigs across the board. Like, that's awesome. Now, obviously, there's another voice there. More money is going to get spent possibly because of what the mechanic wants. That might be a nice to have. I remember there was, we were dealing with the shops from Prince George's County, and when we were speccing, College Park slider truck, and we had them sit in like, hey, what did we miss here? Like, what are you guys seeing? And they kind of provide really good feedback. And hey, we're doing these tires instead. If you do this type of thing, this type of shock, we stock that at the shop, so it's easier to get you back in service. We're like, oh, cool, awesome. And then they had a couple, well, like, it would be nice if you guys did this. And it was like, brake pad or brake wear identifiers. And we started out like, well, do you guys do that now? Well, no, but we're looking to go that direction. We're like, oh, okay, like we'll cost it out as an option. And it was like $30-something thousand. And we're like, okay, that's a nice to have, but like, we could do it the old fashioned way. That's fine with us, kind of thing. And so again, there's going to be things that they ask for that's maybe a nice to have in the list and can drive the cost up. So you have to weigh that out. But having them on that committee is going to be huge in the back end of when it goes to the shop the first time. There's no surprises. There's no, big hurdles or things that, you pull it in the shop like, well, I wouldn't have done that because you're going to be in here every 3 months because that part's known to break or that doesn't work or whatever. That's like the worst thing you want to hear when you're taking the fire truck down to the shop. So I think there's a lot there to get that mechanic, other experienced person involved that can kind of help direct or guide through some of that mechanical stuff and the back end of the maintenance when it does go out into the field and is used, it is for sure.
And I'll play devil's advocate on that side there. I know we're back in the spec end now a little bit, but when your mechanic's telling you, hey, if you do this, it's going to make this so much easier on us. You do have to weigh that out. At $30,000 for a wear indicator, that might be a little excessive. But hey, if I don't have to spend 30 minutes taking the side of this pump panel off to get in here and grease these valves and replace one, I can put you back in service a day quicker, something like that. Like and that could be exaggeration to some extent too, but you want to have those conversations, because if I can spend a little bit more money here, but down the road, it's going to allow me to get my fire truck back in service, get me out of a reserve, something that may not work the way I want it to work in my first due, especially in a large, department, or even anywhere where you might not even have a reserve. The ability to put that thing back in service 5 or 6 hours, sooner could pay dividends when it's the only fire truck that you have to go put a house fire out. So, sometimes you have to lay that out and say, all right, well, yeah, this is going to cost me $10,000 here, but over the course of the 20 years I'm going to keep this fire truck, it's going to save me $50,000 in maintenance costs. Then, you gotta, weigh that out. And again, that involves that collaboration between your mechanic, whoever it happens to be, and you as the specifier to get where you want to be with it, right? There's a happy medium there, right? You don't want to you want the fire truck to work well for everybody. And unfortunately in today's environment and market, that costs money. So you have to, again, be careful with that, but there is a happy medium there for everybody.
I kind of want to go back and hit on a point we kind of talked about a little bit. We didn't brush, we did talk about it, but I want to hit it a little bit harder as we kind of transform from that specking committee to training, and some of the things to kind of consider with that too, like where it can and can't go. When we talked about height restrictions, things like that, we talked about like obviously fitting in the firehouse, but what about transfer firehouses, right? Like you're in a city, where can this thing go? Like in Arlington, we only have 9 firehouses. So like when the new tower came in, where can we not park this, right? It's a shorter, it's less in height. It's, easier to drive. So like, can we fit in every firehouse now and transfer? Well, yeah, we can. So, all right, well, what firehouses maybe don't we fit in? All right, well, there's maybe out of the 9 firehouses, there's 2. All right, well, that changes things now. Like battalion chiefs, duty chiefs, communications, like our ECC, they all need to understand that now, because back in the day, when our bay door broke, we had to go to another firehouse because that was the only bay this thing would fit in. So now it's a different thought process, right? Like that unwritten policy or procedure kind of goes away. We can just move it into another bay in the same firehouse. And if there's a fire going on somewhere else or whatever, now there's more flexibility to move that unit around the county if needed, right? So like now it's like, okay, now instead of thinking this could fit in these 3 firehouses out of 9, now it could fit anywhere. So if a unit's going out training, we can relocate this unit maybe, and we have more flexibility now. And that's just something that those people need to know that are in charge and kind of understand. And in a bigger department, or, you're surrounded by other smaller departments and you transfer or relocate on a semi-regular basis, at 3:00 in the morning is not the time to figure out where it can and can't go, especially a ladder truck, a larger, pumper tanker type vehicle that might not have the same clearances as just a regular standard engine. That's plug and play. So I think that's important. And then on the other side of that, driving and training to drive, what is different? So we talked about the new engine in Arlington. We added these connection points now, but we really didn't change anything in the suspension, turning radius, size. Like a lot of the general specifications didn't change. So that's one thing that we need to kind of train on. Say we, not too long ago, we shortened the engines by 10, 12 inches in the wheelbase and the length, and we changed up some of the suspension in the front to maybe have a little bit more of a cramp angle. That vehicle is going to drive differently, right? It's going to drive better, which is great, but I want to go to a cone course and require my drivers to experience that, right, before they go out into the rig or out into the street, right, with that rig. So again, that tighter turn is great, but now I have maybe a little bit more of a backswing, right? So I want to go out into a cone course, again, low hazard, low risk environment to get people to kind of understand that vehicle and get used to it. New tower was the same way, right? Instead of having this big bucket over the front, we went to a mid mount. Now you have a little bit of tail swing, but it's all different now, right? So where am I looking? Where am I looking in my mirrors? So as training takes over and starts this, what is hopeful of a driver training process to train drivers up that are current, and then start with new drivers that might come down in the future, that specking committee needs to be involved in that conversation of what did we change, right? If you hand a person that's really good at training all these specs and say, hey, here's the new fire truck, they're going to look at them and be like, what did you just hand me? I don't know how to read this. What does this actually mean? So whether it's the spec committee coming up with a one pager, an Excel spreadsheet with side-by-side comparisons of things that were changed, a PowerPoint of highlighting the things that were changed, or just, again, going out there, getting hands-on, spending one day with the committees, each one, and going out there and saying, here, how's this? This is what we kind of did. This is what I felt. This is what I noticed. And we can kind of share those ideas so that the training committee can put a good, solid program together. Now, there's the benefit if you have training people on the specking committee, that obviously makes everything better. Smaller departments, that's awesome. But if you start, kind of getting into a bigger department or just more people involved, then there might be some separation there where it's really important for those two to get together. And then it comes down to who's going to attend that dealer training or dealer familiarization, right? There's a lot of good information that comes out of that should be captured, whether it's in PowerPoint or in documentation. So who's responsible for that? Is that the specking committee, the training committee? All that stuff kind of needs to be worked out. I think there's a lot into the handover from specking to training that I think gets missed a lot, where they're just like, here's your rig, bye, good luck, have a good time. And then people are figuring it out on the street, which I think is the worst. No NFPA recommendation, no driving procedure policy should be you just figure it out on the street, right? And so how do we bridge that gap and get good information that's captured forever?
Yeah, you're right, and I think that is key. Is how do you figure that out? And some of that with in regards to angles of approach and departure and the overhang and things like that. Some of that goes all the way back to when you start the spec process, especially if we're talking about ensuring that it meets those demands, like you said, pulling the hill or whatever. You need to make sure that that's in your spec, that those things will all be evaluated and checked before the final sign-off. So that is key. I think that you're right. I think that's one of the big things that's missed, is that we did make a whole bunch of changes on this, especially going from a mid-mount to a rear mount or the other way or to a tiller truck. You have to be able to identify those major changes. And somebody, in the upper echelons of the department need to recognize that this is an issue that needs to be kind of carried through and over. And maybe we spend a little bit more time before we do that transition and get everybody, at least all of our major drivers through, like you said, the cone course. Let's make a commitment to make sure that we're doing this properly and safely so that we're covered. And if we do, someday have a bad day, make a mistake, somebody hits us, we hit somebody, that we can go back and have documented training on how we, went about trying to educate the members and protect ourselves with this change in our apparatus and quite frankly, in our operations to some extent.
Yeah, I always love this saying that, when it comes to driver training and documentation and stuff, 1451, 1500, 1002, like all of the driving standards are pretty clear. Every rig should be trained on. Doesn't matter what it looked like before, and any new rig coming in should have its individual training, documented training, right? Not just training, documented training, so that you have that, CYA, and again, you're giving the members the good information to be good driver operators. We can be as aggressive as you want, but if you don't fully understand the vehicle and how it operates, then it's not good. And I think, that goes into a plug of getting outside training, right? You get a new rig. We made this huge change. We sought outside training. We had people come in to Arlington to help kind of bridge that gap from a rear mount to a mid mount, right? Like there's opportunities there. Interior, right? We had people that had experience inside the department that helped develop some training and pass information along. Like you can't just flip the switch and hope everything works out. Like there's a good opportunity when new rigs come in to get actually good, solid training on the rig. And inform the people. I think it kind of ties into operators manual, all of that stuff too, and understanding it all. You can spend all this money on this rig and, it comes in, and if you don't know how to use it, then it's bad. And back to the saying, it's a Mike Wilbur special. You go in there with a driver training file that's 2 sheets of paper from the last 30 years, Bozo the Clown could beat you in court. And it's like, all right, well, you received some initial training documented on this rear mounted tower, right? Yeah. Well, when the mid mounted tower came in, where's your documentation? Oh, well, I went out and, did some time. When, where, was it successful? What's the program look like? Well, I don't know. And it's like, all right, well, open up your checkbook, right? There's no defense to that, right? You're going to sit there and you're going to feel silly when the questions start asking, they start asking the questions and they're legitimate questions. And you're like, that's really interesting. I never even thought about that. And then they start pulling out standards that have it laid out of what the program should look like. And you're not doing it. I think that's a huge overlooked thing. We have a lot of younger drivers. They're, a lot of them are thirsty for information. But it needs to be packaged the right way too. Just sitting there in a classroom and just talking at their face is not the way to get all the information across. Some of it's hands-on. Some of it might be making videos, one-pagers, using QR codes to help with, memory joggers, whatever it is, right? And now with AI and all the other stuff coming out, it's hard to keep track of all that, but there's so many tools out there to help kind of get this transition to be better than it is. And I think we see it across the board. Doesn't matter the size or the type of department. There's a lot of challenges there, and some are doing really well with it and some are just not. And again, it's that hope and pray that nothing goes wrong. And so I think that, just as important as you sitting down and doing the work at the beginning to spec this fire truck out is to make sure that the intent, the operational capability, all the stuff, all the hard work that committee put in should be passed down to everybody else to understand what was done for the rig, what was done operationally, why it was done that way. And if they can understand the intent, they can help make it better in the future too, because they don't just see, oh, these people did this or whatever, right? I know people have asked for tip controls on ladder trucks in Arlington or other things like that. And it's like, well, we're not doing it because downtime, out of service time, we start going down the list of all the issues, the training that might happen because of that and because of our current system and everything working out. And they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And they might not fully agree with it, but they at least understand why we're not doing that. And now maybe there's something that comes out that can maybe bridge the gap, that might not cost a lot of money, might not be any downtime, but might still be helpful to the operations for them. And now we can have a legitimate conversation instead of the last time I brought something up, they just sloughed me off, right? So I think there's a lot there that, when this rig comes in and what we can do to kind of get it to its full potential. Because a ladder truck at $2 to $3 million now, depending on who you buy it from, that is a lot of money to sit in a firehouse and have people that don't know what they're doing with it. That's crazy, right? So how can we do better as a fire service? And I think there's a lot there.
And, you hit on a couple of things there. Is the spec committee does the best they can based on what they were kind of given to fall into in their operating parameters, right? But they might miss something. So it's important that not the spec committee has to reach out and say, hey, what are the things that we missed on this last one? What are the things that would make this better for you? And again, you can't please everybody, and you need to be realistic with some of it. But to have everything kind of tie together at some point and carry those kind of items through to the next build, it's simple. Hey, why do we do this? Well, we've done that for the last 10 years, and we didn't really think about it. And you're right. We probably don't need to do that anymore because of this operational change that we made, right? So let's go back and punt. We can save some money. We can make this change back to the standard. And, maybe it helps us fix another problem that we've identified, in the upcoming builds that we're going to have, right? So maybe it opens space up for this because, what we used to do for this reason we don't need anymore, but we do need the space now. So, again, the committee can easily miss stuff as they're trying to go through, a 15-page spec, and that's just a component list. It's simple to miss something when there's thousands of words on a sheet of paper and abbreviations and things like that. Again, that's not intended, but it just gets missed. So, being able to kind of tie all that together, the mechanic, the operations crew, the spec committee, the training committee, and everything becomes part of that process throughout that whole build.
I think it's just just as important. I think we'll wrap this up on this kind of last part of this topic, but rig comes in, you rock it, everything worked out perfectly. Never happens, but let's just make pretend for the day that you didn't mess anything up on the spec. Training went phenomenal. Everybody knows everything there is to know about the rig. Now that spec committee, instead of dissolving out, I mean, there's still things that committee can do. Is when they come back from final inspection, capture the information of what could we have done better next time in the spec to make final inspection go better and make our intentions better known. For us, I remember one of the front hose troughs that we had in one of the ladder trucks. It was a certain dimension, but we never said how deep it should be into the bumper. So we looked at it like, this looks weird. And they actually sunk it all the way so the lip was right at where the bumper is. And in past specifications, we had it like 7 or 8 inches above the bumper for the lip so that it kind of leveled out and it didn't get into our angle of approach or departure. Well, you look through the spec, it was never mentioned. We just expected that they would do it the same way again, and they didn't. Well, whose fault is that? Well, technically, I guess ours, because we didn't ask for exactly what we wanted. We just had an expectation that wasn't written down. So that was something we captured, and now in future specs, that would be something now that we're going to ask for. We're going to give them that dimension so that, again, what we expect, we give them all of those details. Well, so we're going to capture that right after final inspection, after the rig comes in, that month after. I even look a year after, right? There should be a meeting a year after the rig in service to get everybody together, figure out who's going to be on the next committee if there's going to be one, and maybe some newcomers, right? And then sit down and have that conversation of explaining the work that needs to be done, how that work almost never stops. You're always taking notes, every call you run, every incident that you have, how much hose did you use on this incident? Like that's an important metric to capture because now the next rig, we might not carry as much hose. Again, operational changes. We now go from hydrants to non-hydrants, non-hydrants to hydrants, whatever that looks like. We start swapping back and forth, doing tanker task forces to nursing, all of those operational changes. There should be somebody looking at it from the apparatus side, even if there's not a rig currently being spec'd, how does this affect our next specification? And then it's educating the next group, right? There's a lot of old timers that have a lot of knowledge in the spec, but these new guys and gals want to get involved. So how do they get involved? Well, it's the education before you start. The first meeting they sit down, they shouldn't be like, I have no idea anything about speccing. Like, teach me everything you want, because you can't spec a rig and teach at the same time. There's just so much work that needs to be involved. They're going to get in the way. They're going to feel like they're not helpful. So all of that time from rig coming into next rig, let's get those people molded up, right? Let's get those people the education, send them out to the conferences, learn about spec and fire trucks, listen to the Apparatus Workshop because it's the best podcast there is out there to learn everything there is about spec and fire trucks, right? Or like, deep dive into all that information and then start having some meetings or training sessions so that those people are prepared to be an asset and not a liability in that committee. And so I think there's so much there that, the committee doesn't just flip the switch on and flip the switch off. It needs to be almost a standing committee, or at least person or two that you maybe expand and contract as you kind of go through the speccing process. But somebody in each department or company should be eyes on that prize and just doing that work little by little, because then it makes it so much more manageable when you sit down and you flip that piece of paper over, because you have a list now of things to talk about.
Right. Yeah, you have a plan moving forward. So,
yeah, I think that was a lot of information. I think it was, I don't want to say all over the place, but there's a lot to consider there. And I think, there might even be stuff that we missed in this that, when the delivery comes in. But I think if you are getting ready to deliver a fire truck, if you listen to this, there's a good list to start planning for. And even if you're getting ready to spec the next rig, maybe start planting some of these seeds and getting these people involved that should be getting involved with training or whatever, and start, hey, you got a lot of work to do. Or if you're getting ready to get a fire truck, there's work you can do right now to make all of this stuff easier for the delivery and then the next, rig that you're going to buy down the road. So,
yeah, I think the key is that, even in today's build times, that when you sign that contract that says we're getting this fire truck, the work doesn't stop. it continues up until at least that first year that thing's in service. And then probably, as we kind of talked about, is going to keep going. So that process is just a continual process. And even again, and maybe even more so in today's environment where it takes so long to get that truck that you have to just keep that thing constantly rolling down the road. So,
right.
The process is constantly evolving, and the people are moving in and out, but somebody's got to stay together. So it's constant work here to make this spec and training process, go together.
And the last note before we wrap up, or to wrap up on, I would say, is that one person keeping an ear onto the ground of specking and being like immersed in it in every department, that saves the department from getting those long lead times and being surprised, right? Like, I think that was a huge shock to a lot of people, is because nobody was paying attention. They get a fire truck in 2 years, a year and a half, let's say, even just a year, and they're calling like, hey, next year I need a fire truck. And they're like, oh yeah, by the way, it's going to be 4. And they're like, what? This is crazy. Now the whole entire, specking, everything's kind of offset. Well, if you have that person that's in it, they're going to see the market. They're going to be into it, and they're going to kind of notice that trend and be like, okay, something's happening here that's not normal. How are we going to get ahead of this? Because we can't fall behind. We don't have the luxury to do that.
Right.
So, all right. I appreciate everybody listening in. Hopefully you got some good information. Any questions about the information we provided, any future podcast ideas, please reach out. Email address is Nick, N-I-C-K, Wilbur, W-I-L-B-U-R, at evr.solutions. And feel free to drop us a note, and we'll consider it for future podcasts. But as always, be safe out there and keep training.
This episode is brought to you by Rescue Intelitech, innovating solutions to keep firefighters safe. Their Solo Rescue Decon Washer helps reduce cancer risks by cleaning contaminated gear quickly and effectively. Learn more at rescueintelitech.com, because clean gear